What if, even with all this information we have now, mountains of it, our decisions are still fundamentally, well, a bit messy? What if the way our brains are actually built makes us, prone to errors?
It's a really fascinating thought, isn't it? You'd think, okay, more data, more knowledge, that should equal perfect rationality.
Right.
But we just don't see that consistently. Individuals, groups, they make choices that seem, well, let's just say less than ideal sometimes.
Exactly. And that's really what we want to dig into today. We're looking at a stack of sources a listener actually shared with us.
Ah, okay.
And we're going to try and unpack two really big interconnected ideas, systemic thinking and cognitive bias.
Right. And the goal here isn't just, defining terms. We want to look at the research, see how these two things interact, and understand how they, often quietly, shape how you perceive reality, the choices you make, the big systems you're part of.
So the mission is kind of extracting the key takeaways, to help you, the listener, navigate all this complexity a bit better.
Precisely. Give you some tools, some perspective.
Okay, let's jump in then. Systemic thinking. What is that really at its heart?
Well, the sources make a really good point. It's less a specific technique you pull out of a toolbox and more fundamentally a mindset shift.
A mindset? Okay.
Yeah, it's about moving away from looking at problems or events just in isolation.
Like tunnel vision.
Kind of. And instead, seeing them as parts of bigger, dynamic, interconnected systems, it pushes you beyond that simple, linear A causes B way of thinking.
So instead of a straight line, it's more like a web, a network.
Exactly. A web is a great way to put it. You start noticing the interconnectedness, how different elements influence each other, often in feedback loops.
Okay.
And you appreciate holism. That's the idea that the system as a whole has properties, behaviors that you just wouldn't see by looking at the individual pieces alone.
It's more than the sum of its parts, like that flock of birds idea you mentioned.
Perfect example. You can study one bird all day, but you'll never predict the incredible patterns the whole flock makes together. That pattern emerges from their interactions.
Got it. More than just the pieces.
Right. And then there's the idea of boundaries. This is super important.
Boundaries?
Yeah, because you, the observer, are the one defining where the system starts and stops for your analysis. And where you draw that line. It radically changes what you see, what you focus on, and what solutions seem possible. Sometimes the answer lies just outside the boundary you initially set.
Wow, that's a really powerful thought. Our perspective actually sets the limits of what we might fix.
It absolutely can. Then you have feedback loops. These are crucial. They're really the engines driving change within a system.
Okay.
Think of them as processes or maybe policies, perceptions, even practices, where the output of something circles back around to become an input again.
So it feeds back on itself.
Exactly. And that can either reinforce a trend, make it grow stronger, like compound interest that's a positive or reinforcing loop, or it can balance things out, stabilize them like a thermostat maintaining temperature. That's a negative or balancing loop. Understanding these loops helps you see how a system might behave over time.
And we already touched on emergent properties, those unexpected behaviors that just sort of pop up.
Yes, exactly. The surprising things that arise from all this complex interactions, things you just couldn't predict by looking at the parts in isolation. And the last core principle the sources mention is the need for multiple perspectives.
Right. Can't see the whole picture from one spot.
You really can't. You need those diverse viewpoints to even begin to grasp the complexity properly.
So, okay, why is adopting this kind of mindset so critical, especially now?
Well, just look around, right? We're facing incredibly complex, interconnected problems, climate change, global health stuff, economic instability.
Yeah, it feels like everything's connected.
It really is. And systemic thinking helps you untangle those webs of cause and effect. It improves decision-making because you're considering the wider impacts, the potential ripple effects, the long-term consequences.
Not just the immediate fix.
Exactly. And it helps you identify those potential high-leverage points, those spots in the system where a small, focused change could actually trigger a much larger positive shift throughout the whole thing. It's really like upgrading your mental software from a basic linear program to a more sophisticated networked understanding.
That makes sense. Speaking of upgrading our thinking, the sources bring up this term, the science of systemic thinking. That sounds formal. Is it like a distinct academic field?
You know, it's less a single established field and more, the sources describe it as a synthesized framework, a kind of meta-discipline pulling insights from general systems theory, sure, but also cognitive science, complexity science, cybernetics, a whole range of areas.
Okay.
It's about looking at the systemic mindset itself as something that can be and is studied scientifically.
And the science part refers both to studying the systems out there and also how we think about them, our own cognition.
Exactly that. It's got that dual focus. Part of it is understanding the human cognitive processes that actually enable us to think systemically. Things like metacognition, thinking about your own thinking and the ability to mentally map out complex relationships. These aren't simple skills.
Right.
But the other part is applying scientific methods to the systems themselves, like building sophisticated computer models, system dynamics models, to simulate how these complex systems behave and test interventions.
Okay, and let's circle back to that idea of boundaries, how we define the system. That seems like a major entry point for our own biases, doesn't it?
This is precisely where the two main threads of our discussion, systemic thinking and cognitive bias, really start to weave together tightly. If your initial framing of a system, where you draw those boundaries, is skewed by some pre-existing bias or maybe just a really narrow perspective,
then everything that follows is built on shaky ground.
Potentially, yes. Any analysis, no matter how rigorous or scientific it seems afterwards, could be fundamentally flawed because the starting point was off. It can create this sort of meta-level feedback loop where your bias framing leads to a biased understanding, which then just confirms and reinforces the original bias.
Okay, so our own internal mental wiring can actually stop us from seeing the system clearly, which leads perfectly into this next bit the sources explore using artificial intelligence as an analogy. This feels like a really concrete way to grasp some of this.
It really is. Modern AI, especially things like machine learning, deep learning, the large language models everyone's talking about, they offer a surprisingly powerful lens for thinking about complex systems, and maybe even the quirks of our own minds.
How exactly does AI fit in here?
Well, think about how these AIs operate. They churn through absolutely massive amounts of interconnected data points, right? And they learn to identify patterns, complex interactions, often without being explicitly programmed for each one. They can even exhibit surprising emergent behaviors, things the designers didn't directly code in.
Which sounds a lot like the complex adaptive systems you were describing earlier.
Exactly. There's a strong parallel. In fact, AI tools are now actually used to build those system dynamics models we mentioned, to simulate really complex interactions and help researchers find those potential leverage points for change.
And the connection to bias. I know AI bias is a big topic.
It is, and this is where the analogy gets really, really insightful for understanding ourselves. Research consistently shows that cognitive biases, often strikingly similar to well-known human biases, can actually emerge in these AI models.
Emerges. So they aren't deliberately programmed to be biased?
Generally, no. It's often a result of the data they're trained on, which of course reflects existing societal biases and sometimes aspects of their underlying architecture. It provides this really stark illustration of how systemic inputs, whether that's trillions of words from the internet for an AI or a human's lifetime of cultural immersion and personal experiences, how those inputs fundamentally shape the cognitive outputs, including the biases that come along for the ride.
So the bias isn't inherent, it's learned from the system the AI interacts with.
That's a great way to put it. And the sources go even further, pointing to research on collective biases emerging in groups of interacting AI agents.
Collective biases.
Yeah.
Even if the individual AIs weren't biased to start?
That's the fascinating part. Even if you design individual agents to be relatively unbiased, the way they interact, share information, and learn from each other can lead to biased patterns and outcomes at the group level. It gives us a kind of computational model for how pervasive societal biases might develop and stick around in human populations. It suggests it's not just about individual prejudice, but potentially an emergent property of our social systems themselves. It makes that very complex, abstract idea feel much more tangible.
That AI parallel really does help make the leap. It shows bias isn't solely an individual failing, it can be systemic, which brings us squarely to cognitive bias itself, this universal human thing.
Right. Cognitive biases, they're essentially systematic patterns of deviation from what we might consider purely rational or objective judgment. Think of them as predictable glitches or tendencies in how our brains process information.
Glitches.
Well, maybe shortcuts is a better word. They lead us to construct a subjective reality that isn't always a perfect reflection of objective truth. And critically, they often operate beneath the surface, unconsciously.
So they're not just random slip-ups. They are predictable, structured errors.
Exactly. Structured, predictable. And they largely stem from our brain's heavy reliance on what are called heuristics.
Mental shortcuts.
Mental shortcuts, exactly. Rules of thumb. They evolved because they were incredibly useful for making quick decisions, especially under conditions of uncertainty, which was pretty much constant in our evolutionary past.
Right. You don't have time for a full analysis if something might be about to eat you.
Precisely. Daniel Kahneman's work on dual process theory is really key here. He talks about System 1 thinking fast, automatic, intuitive, emotional. It runs on these heuristics, and it's where most biases take root.
And System 2.
System 2 is the slower, more deliberate, analytical, effortful mode of thought. It can monitor and potentially override System 1, but it takes energy and attention.
And System 1 is the default, right? It's always trying to jump in because it's easier.
It's definitely the path of least resistance. Our whole cognitive setup reflects this trade-off.
Yeah.
The speed and efficiency of System 1 versus the accuracy and rationality that System 2 can provide, but only if we engage it properly. In today's complex world, that trade-off has huge implications for the quality of our decisions.
And the sources are really clear on this. These biases aren't just something some people have, they're universal.
They really are fundamental to human cognition. Across time, across cultures, age, gender, everyone operates with these biases. And importantly, they're not necessarily flaws in the design.
Not flaws. How so?
Their evolutionary origins suggest they were adaptations, features that actually helped us survive. Think about reacting instantly to a rustle in the grass that might be a predator.
That sounds like the availability heuristic. You jump because you quickly recall danger.
Could be. Or loss aversion, the tendency to feel the pain of a loss more strongly than the pleasure of an equivalent gain. That would encourage caution, clinging to resources, avoiding potentially fatal mistakes.
Okay.
Error management theory even suggests we evolved to err on the side of making the less costly error when faced with ambiguity. Better to mistake a stick for a snake than a snick for a stick, right? Sensible strategy in a risky ancestral environment.
So great for dodging dangers back then, maybe not so helpful for, say, evaluating complex financial investments today.
That's the heart of the modern mismatch idea. These cognitive tools, brilliantly adapted for rapid, good-enough decisions in our evolutionary past, can become systematic liabilities when we try to apply them to abstract, long-term, data-heavy problems in the modern world. Understanding that mismatch is absolutely crucial if we want to mitigate their negative effects.
And while the underlying mechanisms are universal, does culture play a role in how they manifest?
It does. It's a dynamic interplay. The core cognitive machinery is there in all of us, but its expression can definitely be shaped or modulated by the systemic context, cultural norms, education, individual experiences. Well, for example, a culture that strongly emphasizes individualism might see different expressions of self-serving bias compared to a more collectivist culture, where maybe in-group favoritism is more pronounced. Age also matters. Younger people might rely more on verbatim details, while adults use more gist-based memory, which can interact with bias differently. And while fundamental mechanisms are shared across genders, social roles and stereotypes themselves, systemic factors might influence how certain biases are expressed or perceived.
And it goes even deeper, right, into our biology.
Absolutely. There's growing evidence for genetic predispositions influencing susceptibility to certain biases and clear neuroscientific links. The amygdala, involved in emotion processing, is strongly linked to negativity bias. The prefrontal cortex, crucial for executive function, plays a role in biases like anchoring. It underscores that these aren't just abstract psychological concepts, they're grounded in our physiological systems, which are themselves complex adaptive systems.
Okay, so summing that up, we're dealing with this built-in, universal, biologically rooted set of mental shortcuts. They're often unconscious, they were historically adaptive, but now they cause predictable errors in modern contexts. And the list is long. Confirmation bias, anchoring, availability, hindsight.
Dunning-Kruger, optimism bias, sunk cost fallacy, fundamental attribution error, in-group bias. Yeah, there are dozens cataloged.
And the sources highlight one in particular as being especially problematic for dealing with all the others. The bias blind spot.
Yes, the bias blind spot. It's the tendency to readily recognize biases in other people's thinking while remaining largely oblivious to our own.
That sounds like the ultimate catch-22 for trying to improve.
It's a huge systemic barrier to actually mitigating bias. If you genuinely don't perceive your own thinking as potentially biased, why would you put in the effortful System 2 work needed for systemic analysis or de-biasing strategies?
Right. You don't see a problem to fix.
Exactly. And scaled up to a societal level, this collective bias blind spot allows systemic biases embedded in our institutions, our norms, our laws, to persist largely unchallenged. It creates a really damaging feedback loop that reinforces the very biased outcomes we might claim we want to avoid.
Okay, so these biases aren't just mental quirks. They have tangible, real-world effects. How do they actually ripple out and impact different parts of our lives and society?
Oh, the effects are incredibly far-reaching. Take just our perception of time, or how we interpret history, or even how memory works.
How so?
Well, biases like the recency effect make recent events feel more important. Hindsight bias makes past events seem like they were always inevitable, completely obscuring the uncertainty and complexity people faced at the time. Makes it harder to learn genuine lessons, doesn't it?
Yeah, if it was inevitable, why bother analyzing?
Exactly. Optimism bias can warp our expectations about the future, often making us underprepare. Confirmation bias, as you might expect, leads us to selectively remember or focus on historical evidence that fits our existing narratives or beliefs.
So we cherry-pick history to fit our story.
Pretty much. And the availability heuristic means that vivid, easily recalled historical moments, maybe a major war, a financial crisis, can feel disproportionately significant or representative, even if they weren't statistically. The sources mention how our understanding of events like Vietnam or the 2008 crash is still heavily shaped by these kinds of biases.
And memory itself isn't like a recording.
Not at all. It's fundamentally reconstructive. Every time you recall something, you're essentially rebuilding it, and that process is filtered through your current biases. Consistency bias subtly rewrites your past beliefs to align better with your present ones. Confirmation bias affects what details you retrieve. Availability influences what comes to mind most easily. There's even rosy retrospection, the tendency to remember past events more positively than they might have felt at the time.
So our collective memory, our shared history, is constantly being filtered and reshaped by these biases.
Absolutely. It fundamentally shapes our shared knowledge and the narratives that define our societies.
And it doesn't stop at history or memory. It affects our physical health, too.
Definitely. Our biases significantly influence our health-related behaviors. Optimism bias is a classic one. People consistently underestimate their personal risk for things like smoking-related diseases or texting while driving.
It won't happen to me.
That's the one. Confirmation bias can lead people to cling to health beliefs or practices even when confronted with strong contradictory evidence, maybe seeking out information that supports their preferred diet or supplement. And the sources bring up this really interesting concept called Schrödinger's cat bias in medicine.
Schrödinger's cat bias. Like the quantum physics thought experiment. How does that apply here?
The idea is that in medicine, you often can't truly observe the counterfactual. You can see what happens when you give the treatment, but you can't simultaneously see what would have happened to that exact same patient at that exact same time if you hadn't given the treatment.
Ah, I see. You only see one outcome.
Right. And because of this inherent uncertainty and lack of a direct comparison, there can be a cognitive tendency to overestimate the benefits of interventions and underestimate the potential harms or the possibility that the patient might have gotten better anyway. It makes truly objective assessment difficult.
That's fascinating. And it's not just patients who are biased, presumably.
Oh, absolutely not. Medical professionals are human too. They're susceptible to the same biases. Diagnostic errors can stem from anchoring too heavily on initial symptoms, or availability bias where a recent memorable case unduly influences the diagnosis of the current patient, or confirmation bias leading them to seek tests that confirm their initial hunch while downplaying results that don't fit.
So it creates this complex web. Maybe genetic factors influence biases, which influence health choices, which have physical consequences.
It's a classic systemic feedback loop. Our biology, our psychology, our behaviors, and our health outcomes are all deeply intertwined. And again, cognitive patterns that might have been adaptive for immediate survival decisions in the past can become maladaptive when dealing with the complexities of long-term health management in the modern world.
This is really pushing into some deep philosophical areas too, isn't it? Ideas about free will, how we even know things. Epistemology.
It certainly raises profound questions. The findings from cognitive science about how much of our decision-making is influenced by unconscious processes definitely challenge traditional simplistic notions of free will. How free is a choice if it's heavily shaped by biases we're not even aware of? And in epistemology, the study of knowledge itself biases are central. Confirmation bias, anchoring, availability. They fundamentally affect how we acquire information, how we interpret it, how we decide what's valid or true. They act as systemic filters on our perception, potentially leading to distorted views and firmly entrenched, incorrect beliefs. Our very grasp on truth is mediated by these cognitive tendencies.
And how does this play into broader belief systems, like religion or even just social beliefs?
It seems deeply connected. Some research suggests certain evolved cognitive tendencies, like our hyperactive agency detection, seeing intention everywhere, or our preference for teleological thinking, seeing purpose in natural events, might predispose us towards religious or supernatural explanations.
Interesting.
And once strong beliefs are formed, whether religious, political, or otherwise, they tend to powerfully amplify biases like confirmation bias. You actively seek out, interpret, and remember information in ways that bolster those core beliefs. Implicit biases, often absorbed unconsciously from our surrounding culture and social norms, shape our automatic judgments about different groups of people. And the halo effect, where one positive trait makes us assume someone has other positive traits, significantly influences our social perceptions within these belief structures.
Feels like almost nothing is immune. Even supposedly objective fields like, say, physics or math. Logic itself.
Even there, the human element means bias can creep in, though perhaps in more subtle ways. Confirmation bias can influence how scientists interpret ambiguous data. Even in fields like physics, the interpretation of quantum mechanics experiments is one area where this has been discussed.
Okay.
And that Schrödinger's cat bias we talked about in medicine. The sources suggest it points to a general epistemological challenge relevant to any field dealing with high uncertainty, where true counterfactuals are impossible to observe. It highlights a potential bias in how we assess outcomes whenever we can't directly compare what happened with what would have happened otherwise.
So it affects how we evaluate uncertain phenomena broadly.
Exactly. Even in mathematics and logic, our intuitive cognitive processes can clash with formal rules. Probabilistic reasoning is notoriously counterintuitive for us. We fall prey to the gambler's fallacy, we neglect base rates, we show systematic overconfidence in our judgments under uncertainty. Our brains just aren't naturally wired to be great statisticians.
And the sources make a really crucial distinction here between a cognitive bias and a logical fallacy. What's the difference?
That's a key point for understanding how to address these issues. Cognitive biases, as we've discussed, are these ingrained, often unconscious patterns in how our minds process information. They're rooted in our cognitive architecture. They're harder to overcome and often require systemic interventions or environmental changes, not just willpower.
Okay, they're deep-seated.
Right. Logical fallacies, on the other hand, are errors in the structure of an argument or reasoning in the moment. Things like straw man arguments, ad hominem attacks, appeals to emotion. These are often mistakes in how an argument is constructed, sometimes deliberate, sometimes just due to lack of training in critical thinking.
So you can address fallacies more directly with logic training.
To a large extent, yes. Learning critical thinking skills can help you spot and avoid logical fallacies in your own and others' arguments. But, and this is critical, simply teaching logic doesn't necessarily fix underlying cognitive biases. They operate at a different, deeper level. You need different strategies.
And that difficulty with counterfactuals, the Schrödinger's cat thing, links back here too.
Yes, because our fundamental inability to access true counterfactuals makes learning from experience itself inherently prone to bias. We think we learned X caused Y, but maybe Y would have happened anyway, or for different reasons. This difficulty is actually where tools like AI simulation, mentioned earlier, could potentially help us humans overcome this limitation by modeling those what-if scenarios we can't observe directly.
Okay, shifting focus slightly. How do these biases connect to our mental states, our psychological well-being, and even the large-scale belief structures in society?
There are definite links to mental health. Negativity bias, for example, the tendency to focus more on negative stimuli and experiences, is strongly implicated in conditions like depression and anxiety. Biases can also fuel maladaptive communication patterns and behaviors in relationships. And socially, biases like the halo effect or conformity pressure shape our interactions and judgments constantly. Our theory of mind, our ability to understand others' mental states, interacts complexly with biases too. At the societal level, you see these individual tendencies scaling up into powerful collective biases.
Like
In-group favoritism driving prejudice, the bandwagon effect creating fads or political swings, authority bias leading to unquestioning obedience. These shape our social norms, maintain stereotypes, and define cultural narratives. And then closing the loop, these very norms and narratives become part of the systemic environment that influences how individuals develop their own biases. It's a potent, self-reinforcing cycle. Our individual cognitive landscapes collectively shape the social systems we inhabit.
It really sounds like these biases aren't just abstract concepts floating around. They're actively shaping our lives, our communities, our world. Let's make this even more concrete. Talk about some tangible examples of biases in action.
Absolutely. You see their effects everywhere, from the deeply personal right up to the global scale. Individually, biases can seriously limit personal growth and success. Think about poor financial decisions driven by overconfidence or loss aversion, or career choices hampered by anchoring on initial expectations. They can damage memory, fuel anxiety, and depression, basically shaping our subjective reality, often not for the better.
And how do they play out in our communities, our relationships with others?
They can be incredibly corrosive. In-group bias, as we mentioned, directly fuels prejudice, mistrust, and conflict between different social groups. Group attribution error leads us to unfairly stereotype an entire group based on the actions of a few individuals. The false consensus effect, assuming everyone else thinks like us, leads to shock, anger, and communication breakdowns when we discover they don't.
Yeah, that sounds familiar.
And within communities or organizations, the bandwagon effect and conformity pressure can stifle dissent and lead to groupthink, where terrible decisions get made because everyone's afraid to speak up or challenge the dominant view.
And one-on-one relationships.
Oh, they're minefields for bias. Confirmation bias might make you constantly focus on your partner's flaws while ignoring their good points. The halo effect could cause you to overlook serious red flags early on because you're dazzled by one positive trait. Self-serving bias makes it hard to take responsibility when things go wrong. It's always the other person's fault, right? Anchoring bias can make it difficult to update your initial, maybe negative impression of someone even when they change. Negativity bias makes you dwell on arguments or criticisms. And the fundamental attribution error leads to that classic double standard. Judging others' mistakes harshly, they're careless, while excusing our own, I was just having a bad day.
Wow. Laid out like that. It's quite a list. And the sources talk about the fractal nature of bias. What does that mean?
It's a really neat concept. It means the same underlying patterns of biased thinking that cause friction and misunderstanding in a marriage or between two neighbors are essentially the same patterns that, when scaled up, fuel conflict between political parties, ethnic groups, or even nations. The context and the scale change, but the fundamental cognitive mechanisms driving the dysfunction, the confirmation bias, the in-group favoritism, the attribution errors, are remarkably consistent.
That's sobering, but maybe also hopeful, if the pattern is the same.
Exactly. It suggests that interventions aimed at understanding and mitigating these core biases could potentially have positive ripple effects across all these different scales of human interaction, from the personal to the international. Addressing the root might help at every level.
Okay, that's a crucial insight. Let's zoom out to that larger scale then. Global reactions, politics, international relations, collective behavior. This seems like an arena where the systemic impact of bias must be incredibly visible.
Politics is practically ground zero for cognitive bias in action, isn't it? Confirmation bias is rampant, fueling polarization, creating echo chambers where people only hear views that reinforce their own. It makes finding common ground incredibly difficult.
Definitely feels that way.
Anchoring bias heavily influences negotiations and policy debates. Initial proposals, early polling numbers, historical precedents often exert a disproportionate pull, making it hard to shift positions. And then you have the whole suite. In-group bias driving tribalism, the bandwagon effect swaying public opinion, negativity bias dominating media coverage, authority bias leading people to follow leaders uncritically, groupthink within parties.
And that bias blind spot must be a massive problem for political actors themselves.
Huge. If leaders and their advisors can't see their own biases, how can they possibly make objective decisions or engage in good faith negotiation?
And how does this translate to international relations?
You see the same biases essentially extrapolated onto the world stage. Confirmation bias reinforces national stereotypes and enemy images. In-group bias fuels nationalism and mistrust of outsiders. Anchoring on past conflicts or historical grievances makes resolving long-standing disputes incredibly challenging. It all contributes to misunderstandings, miscalculations, and significant obstacles to effective diplomacy.
What about large-scale collective behaviors, like in economics or social movements?
Economic bubbles and subsequent crashes are almost textbook examples of collective biases at work. Think about the dot-com bubble or the 2008 housing crisis. They were fueled, in part, by widespread overconfidence, Confirmation bias, everyone ignoring warning signs. Herd behavior, everyone jumping in because everyone else is. And anchoring on ever-increasing prices.
A perfect storm of bias.
Exactly. Similarly, episodes of social unrest or even mass hysteria can demonstrate the power of groupthink and conformity pressures. And today, the rapid spread of misinformation and disinformation online is powerfully accelerated by confirmation bias, people seeking out and believing info that fits their views, and availability bias, emotionally charged or easily recalled stories spreading faster, regardless of truth.
It sounds like these biases often don't just act in isolation, they interact and amplify each other.
Absolutely. The sources talk about this phenomenon as a bias cascade, or sometimes a perfect storm.
Yeah.
Multiple biases feed into and strengthen one another, creating outcomes that are far more extreme or resilient than any single bias could produce on its own.
Can you give an example?
Political polarization is a good one. It's rarely just confirmation bias. It's often confirmation bias plus in-group bias, my side is right, your side is wrong bad, plus anchoring on extreme positions, plus maybe the Dunning-Kruger effect, people overestimating their own political knowledge, plus negativity bias, focusing on the opponent's flaws.
Okay, I see. They stack up.
They stack up and interact. Financial bubbles are another example, often a confluence of overconfidence, confirmation bias, herd behavior, and perhaps loss aversion kicking in when things start to turn. The combined effect is much greater than the sum of the parts, leading to these really entrenched negative systemic outcomes that are hard to break out of.
This really underscores the need for a systemic perspective, which brings us back to how the science of systemic thinking isn't just about understanding systems, but potentially using its principles as a framework for governance, applying them to how we manage, well, everything.
That's the really ambitious and potentially transformative application, yes. The core principles of systemic thinking, interconnectedness, feedback, emergence, boundaries, perspectives, offer a kind of universal toolkit for thinking about governance in a much broader sense than just traditional politics.
Broader how?
It applies equally well to governing our relationship with natural systems, designing human laws and institutions, managing health systems, understanding the laws of human nature itself, and even guiding the evolution of cultural norms and traditions. Effective governance in any of these domains hinges on appreciating the dynamics of the specific system you're working within, including the predictable cognitive tendencies of the humans who are part of that system.
Okay, let's break that down. Applying systemic thinking to natural systems, like the environment, how does that work?
Nature is the ultimate complex adaptive system, right? It's all about interconnectedness, intricate feedback loops. Think about how melting Arctic ice reduces reflectivity, leading to more warming, leading to more melting. A classic positive feedback loop.
Right.
And emergent properties abound. Applying systemic thinking to huge challenges like climate change means deeply understanding these dynamics. It means looking for solutions that work with natural laws and cycles, rather than trying to overpower them. It requires recognizing that human activities aren't separate from, but deeply embedded within these ecological systems.
And our biases get in the way of seeing that.
Massively. Our tendency towards short-term thinking, our optimism bias about the risks, our confirmation bias that might lead us to ignore inconvenient scientific evidence. These are major cognitive hurdles to aligning human systems sustainably with natural ones. Systemic thinking encourages that essential long-term holistic perspective needed to overcome these biases.
Okay, what about informing human-made laws and rules?
Laws and regulations are critical components of our societal systems. A systemic thinking approach pushes us to analyze their broader impacts beyond the immediate intended effect. How does a particular law interact with the economy, with cultural norms, with human psychology? Does it create unforeseen negative consequences, what economists call perverse incentives? Does it accidentally worsen inequality?
So looking for the ripple effects.
Exactly. And it also means designing laws and policies that proactively account for predictable human behavior and biases. This is where insights from behavioral economics come in, using nudges to make it easier for people to make choices that are better for them, or society, things like automatic enrollment in savings plans, simplifying complex forms, or using framing effects to encourage healthier choices.
But there's that ethical concern about nudging, isn't there?
Yeah.
And the bias of the nudgers.
Absolutely. This is a critical point the sources emphasize repeatedly. If nudges aren't transparent, if they aren't genuinely aimed at the public good, they risk becoming manipulative. And more fundamentally, the designers of these policies and nudges are human, with their own biases and blind spots.
The paradox you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. Using knowledge of bias to design better systems requires a meta-level awareness and governance of the design process itself. Things like ensuring diverse perspectives on design teams, being transparent about the goals and methods, constantly evaluating the outcomes to avoid accidentally embedding new biases or causing unintended harm.
How does all this apply to domains like health, human nature, and culture?
Well, a health system is clearly a complex system. Biological factors interacting with lifestyle choices, socioeconomic conditions, environmental exposures, healthcare access, government policies, you name it. Improving public health requires understanding this whole web. And as we discussed, mitigating biases in both patients and practitioners is a key leverage point.
And human nature itself.
Applying a systemic and cognitive lens here means acknowledging the predictable influence of our evolved biases as a baseline reality, not an aberration. It suggests we should design our social systems, education, economics, politics to account for these inherent human traits, channel them constructively where possible, mitigate their negative effects where necessary. Don't base system designs on an unrealistic ideal of pure rationality that humans rarely achieve.
Okay. And culture.
Cultures and traditions can also be viewed as complex adaptive systems, evolving sets of shared beliefs, values, norms, and practices. Systemic thinking helps analyze how these emerge, how they're maintained, often through social learning and conformity biases, and where there might be leverage points, like education, media, leadership, to guide cultural evolution towards more adaptive or equitable forms. But this has to be done ethically, respecting diversity, and recognizing that today's norms might themselves be products of historical accidents or past collective biases, which open space for conscious evolution.
So it sounds like systemic thinking offers a kind of unifying language to talk about all these seemingly different kinds of laws, natural laws, human laws, health principles, cultural norms.
Precisely. It provides a common framework and a shared toolkit. It helps us see that each of these domains functions as a system with its own constraints, feedback loops, and emergent properties. This allows for powerful cross-domain learning, for instance. Insights about resilience from ecology might inform how we design more resilient social or economic systems. It encourages a much more holistic, integrated approach to tackling the complex challenges facing us globally.
And the sources suggest that achieving this vision, like a healthier society on a balanced planet, requires more than just better thinking. It requires a shift in our underlying values.
Absolutely. A fundamental point is that many of our current problems stem from values often reinforced by our cognitive biases that prioritize short-term gains, individual benefits, or simplistic solutions. Moving towards truly sustainable and equitable systems likely requires a collective shift towards valuing long-term well-being, collective responsibility, and embracing complexity. This value shift is perhaps the biggest challenge, and it's deeply intertwined with the need for systemic thinking, bias mitigation, and education.
We've established pretty clearly why systemic thinking is so important and how our biases are a major obstacle. Let's get practical again.
Yeah.
How do we actually get better at this? Why do we so often deviate from thinking systemically, even if we sort of know we should?
Well, our deviation isn't random, as we've said. It's often a predictable consequence of how our minds are structured. That system 1 versus system 2 dynamic is key here.
Right, the fast versus slow thinking.
Systemic thinking is fundamentally a system 2 activity. It requires deliberate effort, focused attention, analytical reasoning. We deviate, we fall back on easier ways of thinking whenever system 1's fast, intuitive, often biased outputs take over inappropriately.
Which happens when?
Lots of situations. When we're under time pressure, when we're stressed, when we're facing information overload, what psychologists call high cognitive load. When system 2 is busy with something else, or simply when the bias is subtle and we don't even notice the need to engage our more analytical thinking. The internal dynamics of when and how we engage system 2 are crucial for applying systemic thinking effectively.
Basically, because thinking systemically is just plain hard work for our brains.
It is cognitively demanding, yes. Our processing capacity is limited. So, under pressure or when overloaded, we naturally default to those simpler, faster System 1 heuristics, those mental shortcuts. And while those shortcuts were adaptive, as we discussed, they become traps when dealing with modern, abstract, complex situations.
Like using the availability heuristic for climate change.
Exactly. A vivid, but perhaps statistically minor risk grabs our attention, while the slow, creeping, abstract threat of climate change struggles to compete for mental resources, even though its long-term systemic impact is far greater.
And we just seem wired to struggle with certain kinds of information, long-term stuff, probabilities, abstract concepts.
We really do. We have a strong tendency to discount the future costs, future benefits, which makes things like saving adequately for retirement or tackling climate change incredibly difficult psychologically. We wrestle with complexity and uncertainty. We often ignore probabilities, base rate neglect. We prefer eliminating a small risk entirely over significantly reducing a larger one, zero risk bias, and we're uncomfortable with ambiguity effect.
We're bad intuitive statisticians.
Pretty much, yeah. We fall for the gambler's fallacy. We misuse base rates. We're systematically overconfident in our probabilistic judgments. Add to that the power of emotion. Strong feelings can easily override System 2 analysis, leading to choices based on affect heuristic. If it feels good, it must be right. And social influences are huge. Conformity, the bandwagon effect, deference to authority can all lead us to abandon our own systemic insights if the group or leader is heading in a different direction.
And layered on top of all that is the bias blind spot you mentioned earlier. That must be a primary reason we don't even try to engage System 2 more often for systemic thinking.
It's a massive impediment, absolutely. If you genuinely believe your own thinking is objective and rational, you simply don't perceive the need to engage in the effortful, uncomfortable process of challenging your assumptions, seeking out disconfirming evidence, or mapping out complex system dynamics. Why bother? And confirmation bias acts like a lock-in mechanism. It makes it incredibly difficult to learn from new information or experiences that contradict our existing mental models, even if those models are demonstrably inadequate for navigating the complexity we face. It keeps us stuck in simplified, often inaccurate ways of seeing the world.
And these deviations aren't just one-off mistakes. They feed back on themselves, right?
Yeah.
Creating loops that reinforce the non-systemic thinking.
Precisely. It's not just that we make a biased decision. That decision then shapes our subsequent reality in ways that can make the bias harder to correct. An initial biased investment might lead to the sunk cost fallacy, throwing good money after bad because we're psychologically committed. A decision based on groupthink might create social pressure that reinforces conformity and makes future dissent even harder. These feedback loops entrench non-systemic thinking within individuals and, crucially, within organizations and societies.
Which suggests that solutions can't just be about telling individuals to think better. We need to change the systems and environments too.
That's a key implication. While individual awareness and education are necessary first steps, they're often insufficient on their own. We also need to think about designing systems, processes, and environments, choice architecture, decision-making protocols, information presentation in ways that make systemic thinking easier and biased thinking harder. Plus, using tools, maybe like AI, to help us overcome our limitations.
Okay, so given all these challenges, what can we actually do? How do we move towards what the sources call systemic rectification? How do we improve, mitigate these biases, govern ourselves more wisely?
The sources cover a range of strategies, often grouped under the term debiasing. The aim isn't necessarily to eliminate bias entirely. That might be impossible given how deep-rooted it is, but to reduce its negative impact.
And it starts with awareness.
Awareness and education are foundational, yes. Learning about specific biases, understanding the dual process model, developing general critical thinking skills, that's the baseline. But as we've stressed, simply knowing about a bias often isn't enough to stop you from falling prey to it, especially under pressure. The bias blind spot is strong.
So what are some of the more active techniques we can use beyond just awareness?
Well, there are several evidence-based techniques, things like perspective taking, actively and consciously trying to see a situation from another person's point of view, especially someone with different experiences or incentives. Individuation, deliberately focusing on the specific characteristics of an individual rather than relying on group stereotypes.
Okay.
Perspective hindsight, sometimes called a pre-mortem analysis. Before launching a project or making a big decision, you imagine it has already failed spectacularly, and then you work backwards to figure out why it might have failed. This helps uncover risks and assumptions you might be optimistically overlooking.
That sounds useful, like a structured way to fight optimism bias.
It is. Also, deliberately seeking diverse perspectives, actively bringing in people with different backgrounds, viewpoints, and expertise to challenge assumptions and identify blind spots. Related to this is appointing a devil's advocate whose specific role is to argue against the prevailing plan.
Makes sense.
Simply, slowing down decision-making can help building in pauses, requiring justification, forcing System 2 engagement. Using checklists or algorithms introduces objective criteria and reduces reliance on intuition, especially for routine decisions. And establishing clear feedback mechanisms to systematically track the outcomes of decisions allows for learning and adjustment over time.
And are these techniques actually used in practice, like in organizations?
Yes, many organizations are trying to implement these with varying degrees of success. You see them in formal training workshops on bias and critical thinking, software systems with built-in warnings or prompts to check assumptions, performance feedback reviews designed to counter certain biases, role-playing exercises for perspective taking or design empathy, project management teams using pre-mortem analysis, deliberately building diverse project teams or advisory groups, using choice architecture and nudging and designing internal processes or customer interactions, setting helpful defaults, simplifying forms, and implementing structured decision processes like checklists, algorithms, or scoring rubrics, especially in areas like hiring or investment.
Designing the system itself to make bias less likely, that seems like a really powerful systemic approach.
It is potentially the most impactful approach because it goes beyond relying solely on individual vigilance, which we know is often fragile. Choice architecture, as we discussed, is about structuring the decision environment, the context in which choices are made to gently guide people towards better outcomes without restricting their freedom. Setting retirement savings to opt out rather than opt in is a classic example.
But it needs to be ethical and transparent.
Absolutely crucial. Otherwise, it just becomes manipulation. And it tends to work best in relatively stable environments where you can predict behavior reasonably well. Public policy is also increasingly incorporating these behavioral insights, simplifying tax forms, making important information more salient, using social norm messages.
And what about technology? Can AI help us debias ourselves?
Technology, especially AI, presents this fascinating dual role. On the one hand, if AI systems are developed carelessly or trained on biased data without proper safeguards, they risk amplifying human biases at unprecedented speed and scale. That's a huge danger. But, on the other hand, AI also holds significant potential as a tool for debiasing humans. It can analyze vast amounts of data to identify subtle patterns of bias in our decisions that we might miss ourselves. It can provide objective information, potentially free from emotional coloring. It can run those complex system simulations we talked about, showing us the likely long-term consequences of choices that our biased intuition might misjudge. This idea of technological debiasing is really promising.
But requires responsible development.
Critically, fairness, transparency, accountability, these need to be baked into AI development from the start if we want to harness its potential for good and avoid exacerbating our existing problems.
And education remains a cornerstone throughout all this.
Absolutely fundamental. We need to cultivate systemic thinking skills, critical thinking, metacognitive awareness, thinking about thinking, understanding diverse perspectives, and collaborative problem-solving abilities right from early education onwards. These need to be seen as core competencies for navigating the 21st century.
But we keep circling back to that meta-level challenge. The people designing the debiasing training, the choice architecture, the AI algorithms, the educational curricula, they're biased too, right?
That is the critical recursive problem highlighted in the sources. The designers of the mitigation systems are not immune. Their own bias, blind spots, their own cultural assumptions, their own heuristics can subtly shape the design of the very tools intended to help others overcome bias. It's bias potentially replicating itself within the solution.
So how do you break that cycle?
A truly systemic approach to debiasing has to include meta-level checks and balances on the design process itself. That means things like insisting on diverse perspectives within the design teams, demanding transparency about the assumptions and values embedded in the system, building in mechanisms for ongoing evaluation and iteration, and fostering a culture of intellectual humility among the designers themselves. It's about applying systemic thinking to the process of implementing systemic thinking and debiasing.
That makes sense. The sources provide a really concrete, specific example of applying this kind of multifaceted systemic thinking to a tricky governance issue. How to handle aging political leaders.
Yes, it's a great case study because it moves beyond a simplistic, potentially biased solution, like just setting an arbitrary age limit. The core challenge is complex, balancing legitimate concerns about potential cognitive decline that can come with advanced age against the undeniable value of experience, wisdom, and what psychologists call crystallized intelligence that often increases with age.
And simple age cutoffs are problematic.
Very. Age is an imperfect proxy for cognitive ability or fitness for office. Strict age limits can feel discriminatory. They remove potentially highly competent and experienced individuals from public service, and they don't guarantee that younger leaders are necessarily better suited. It's a blunt instrument for a nuanced problem.
So a systemic approach would look at more than just chronological age.
Exactly. The sources sketch out a concept. Let's call it something like a cognitive health adjusted service term, or CHAST for short. The idea is to create a multi-factor system for evaluating fitness for continued service. Age would be one factor, maybe interacting with term limits, but critically, it would be combined with other components, such as regular, standardized, independent, and transparent cognitive assessments specifically tailored to the demands of the job. Relevant physical health assessments would also be part of the picture. And crucially, the interpretation of all this data wouldn't be left to political whim. It would likely involve an independent review board, perhaps composed of medical experts, ethicists, maybe former public servants, to provide objective oversight and recommendations.
So continued eligibility wouldn't just be about hitting a certain birthday, but about maintaining a demonstrated threshold of cognitive and physical fitness relevant to the role, assessed holistically.
That's the core idea. It aims to be a more nuanced, evidence-based, and arguably more dignified approach. It tries to balance the public's legitimate interest in competent leadership with respecting the value of experience and avoiding arbitrary age-based discrimination. And this is vital. The sources stress that any such system for managing the outflow of leaders must be coupled with robust succession planning.
Managing the inflow, too.
Precisely. That's another systemic imperative. You need clear pathways for identifying, developing, and preparing the next generation of leaders to ensure continuity, transfer institutional knowledge, and maintain overall capability within the governance system. So something like CHAST addresses the when might someone need to step down question, while succession planning addresses the who is ready to step up question. They are two sides of the same systemic coin for ensuring healthy leadership renewal. Applying systemic thinking itself becomes a key competency for leadership within such a framework.
Okay, pulling all these threads together now as we approach the end of this deep dive. What is the ultimate purpose, the big why, behind cultivating systemic thinking and grappling with our cognitive biases?
I think at the highest level, it's about fostering genuine, sustainable societal well-being and finding a more balanced relationship with the planet we depend on.
How does it help achieve that?
By moving us beyond constantly reacting to symptoms and starting to address the complex, interconnected root causes of our most persistent problems. Things like poverty, crime, public health crises, educational inequality. A systemic lens helps reveal the tangled web of economic, social, environmental, and psychological factors that keep these problems in place, pointing towards more effective, lasting interventions.
So better problem solving.
Better problem solving, definitely. More informed decision-making at all levels. It also fosters the kind of collaboration and mutual understanding needed to tackle what are often called wicked problems, those complex challenges like climate change, where there are multiple stakeholders, conflicting values, and no easy answers. Understanding systemic social biases is also fundamental for promoting genuine equity and justice. And as we touched on with the fractal idea, it can even improve our personal relationships. Ultimately, it's about enhancing our collective capacity to adapt, learn, and co-evolve constructively with our complex and ever-changing environments.
And for the truly global challenges, it's basically indispensable.
I would argue it is. Take climate change. You simply cannot address it effectively without a deep systemic understanding of its drivers, its impacts, the feedback loops involved, the potential leverage points, the issues of global justice it raises. System dynamics modeling is a key tool here. Or think about food security. That requires a food systems approach, looking at the entire life cycle from farm to fork and beyond, considering sustainability, resilience, waste, and equitable access.
Right. The concept of a circular economy is another direct application of systemic thinking, shifting away from our current linear take-make-dispose model towards one where materials are viewed as flowing in interconnected cycles. It involves designing products for longevity, repairability, and reuse, and building feedback loops to ensure materials are recovered and regenerated. Companies like Xerox, who pioneered designing copiers for easy disassembly and remanufacturing decades ago, were early examples of this thinking. The overarching goal is to create resilient, sustainable human systems that can operate in harmony with planetary boundaries.
So as we wrap this up, what's the core synthesis, the main message you hope listeners walk away with from this exploration? I think it's this. In our increasingly complex, interconnected world, developing the capacity for systemic thinking isn't just an intellectual advantage. It's becoming an essential survival skill for navigating reality effectively and building resilient futures. However, our own minds present a constant challenge. Our deeply ingrained cognitive biases systematically distort our perception and judgment, often unconsciously, making clear systemic thinking difficult.
Hmm.
The science of systemic thinking, as the sources frame it, gives us a powerful lens to understand both the external systems we inhabit and the internal systems of our own minds. And crucially, recognizing that our actions, often shaped by these hidden biases, have far-reaching and frequently unintended systemic consequences for our climate, our resources, our health, our social fabric, transforms this whole discussion. Cultivating systemic thinking and actively working to mitigate our biases becomes not just an analytical task, but a profound ethical responsibility. A responsibility we have to ourselves, to each other, and to future generations for ensuring collective well-being.
That really elevates it, doesn't it? From just an interesting psychological or management concept to something fundamental about how we live together on this planet.
The path forward, then, seems to involve several interconnected efforts. We need to embed systemic thinking and bias awareness much more deeply into our education systems, from schools to universities to professional development. We need to inform policy and governance with a systemic lens, incorporating behavioral insights thoughtfully and ethically, maybe exploring ideas like chess or robust succession planning. We need to transform organizational management, applying systemic principles to strategy, operations, leadership development, and implementing debiasing processes. And we need to empower individual awareness, equipping each of us with the understanding to make more informed choices, engage in more constructive dialogue, and contribute to positive change within the systems we are part of.
And the role of AI in this future, it looms large.
It looms incredibly large, and it's full of both peril and promise. As we discussed, AI learns from the data we feed it, biases and all. Without extremely careful systemic governance of algorithmic development and deployment, AI absolutely risks amplifying human irrationality, prejudice, and short-sightedness on a terrifying scale. That's the peril.
But the promise?
The promise is that AI could also become one of our most powerful allies in overcoming our own cognitive limitations. It can help us see our biases through data analysis, provide more objective inputs for decision-making, run those complex simulations to reveal long-term consequences or intuition misses, maybe even personalized debiasing strategies. The trajectory we end up on AI amplifying flaws versus AI helping overcome them depends critically on whether we approach AI development and governance with an ethically informed, deeply systemic mindset right now.
It really feels like this isn't a topic with a neat conclusion. It's an ongoing process, a journey.
Mastery of systemic thinking and bias mitigation is definitely a continuous journey, not a destination you arrive at. The systems around us are constantly changing, evolving. Our biases can adapt and manifest in new ways. So, a mature systemic practice requires ongoing intellectual humility, recognizing the limits of our own understanding. It requires a commitment to continuous learning, a willingness to constantly question and revise our mental models based on new evidence and feedback. It requires what some call adaptive management, making decisions based on the best current understanding, but treating them as experiments to be monitored and adjusted. It's about fostering a positive feedback loop where deeper understanding fuels wiser action, which in turn enhances our collective wisdom and capacity for building a more sustainable and equitable future.
This has been incredibly illuminating. We journeyed from the quirks inside our own heads, the way our brains take shortcuts, all the way out to the massive global systems we're trying to navigate. We started by asking why our decisions often feel flawed, even with so much information available. And we've explored how our built-in cognitive biases are a huge part of that story, how they interact with the complexity of the world, and maybe most importantly, that there are ways to think about this and strategies we can use, from individual awareness to designing better institutions, maybe even leveraging technology like AI responsibly.
And hopefully this knowledge serves as a really valuable tool for you, the listener, a way to perhaps spot the hidden patterns, understand the deeper dynamics, see the subtle connections that others might overlook in the news you read, the choices you make, and the incredibly complex world you live in every day.
So here's a final thought to leave you with, building on everything we've discussed. Given that cognitive biases are such deeply rooted evolutionary adaptations, how much can we realistically expect to change the fundamental ways we think? And what does that reality imply for our aspirations of building a truly unbiased or perhaps even a perfectly rational society? Is that even the right goal? That's it for this deep dive.
This is DigitView.